Dear distinguished guests and audience, I would like to thank you for attending this event today. My name is Majed Al Nekhailawi, and I had the economics section at the UAE Embassy in Canberra. It's evident today that artificial intelligence is supposed to be the technology that will fundamentally redefine how we interact with one another, live, work, do business, and govern. As in any change, there is a risk of disruptions as well as an opportunity to build a better and more inclusive future. For today's webinar, we are delighted to have a panel of experts in Australia here with us today. We have Professor Toby Walsh, Laureate Fellow and Scientia, Professor of AI at the University of New South Wales, Dr. Stephanie Chausis, MedTech Program Manager, Queensland AI Hub, Partnerships at Dataway, and Ambassador for Young Women Leaders in AI, and Mr. Tim Bradley, General Manager, Emerging Technologies, National and International Engagement at the Australian Department of Industry. I will begin with a few opening remarks about artificial intelligence in the UAE. Advances in AI have the potential to improve outcomes, enhance quality, and reduce costs across all sectors. Effective and careful applications of pattern recognition, automated decision-making, and robotic systems show promise for enhancing the quality of life. While advances in AI promise great value for the economy, they will also be the source of disruption as new kinds of work are created and other types of work become less needed. We in the UAE have been looking into the future with great hope, incorporated AI in our national policy platforms, and acknowledge that AI is increasingly becoming an integral element across all aspects of our lives, and affects what it means to be productive, creative, and to exercise free will. As such, in 2017, the UAE government rolled out the UAE National Strategy for AI 2031, which aims to make governance more efficient and transform many sectors, including space, renewable energy, water, and education. The UAE has also adopted many measures to meet its strategic AI objectives. This includes a national program for artificial intelligence designed to embrace advances in AI and robotics for the UAE, identifying and understanding various initiatives, collaborations, partnerships, and breakthroughs in the fields of AI and the impacts that it has on all of mankind. The UAE appointed the world's first Minister of State for AI following a cabinet reshuffle in October 2017, with responsibilities to enhance the UAE's government performance by investing in the latest AI technologies, tools, and applying them across various sectors, as well as overseas funding, which enables experimental pilot projects. The UAE also hosts Mohammed bin Zayed University for Artificial Intelligence, which is the first of its kind worldwide, and it has attracted students from around the world to advance AI technology and propel the UAE's economic diversification. The university offers a Master of Science and PhD programs in 3 of the fastest growing areas of AI: machine learning, computer vision, and natural language processing. In addition, the UAE strategy for the 4th Industrial Revolution, another milestone of achievement, was designed to provide a practical framework for policymakers, as well as supporting national efforts in adopting advanced technologies. The strategy aims at transforming future challenges into opportunities that better serve our country. It also focuses on innovative education, AI, intelligent genomic medicine, and robotic healthcare, efficient government, sustainability, and smart cities. By assessing the UAE's overarching agendas on AI, it's evident that the UAE government continues to take both the theoretical and practical steps towards advancing AI technologies nationwide and creating new industries, pushing for wider government adoption and establishing an international platform where both the private and government sectors can cooperate and collaborate. The aforementioned strategy, policies, and initiatives not only reflect the UAE's desire to become a world leader in AI, but show that the UAE acknowledges the importance and impact of AI in our present day and provides us with insight into the UAE's determination and in integrating AI technologies into the forefront of its strategic policy architecture. The UAE is creating new economic and social opportunities for its citizens, governments, and businesses. By 2031, the UAE is expected to achieve 100% reliance on AI for government services and data analysis. This means effectively implementing AI technology across all sectors of UAE society to increase efficiency, happiness, and economic outcome, as well as enhancing the UAE's credentials to become a global leader in innovation. I am very pleased that the UAE can lead the way in AI, particularly in our region in the Middle East and North Africa. And we aim to work with partners like Australia as both countries prepare to play a greater role in the advancement of AI as a concept and a practice. Thank you all again for joining us this evening. And now I would like to welcome Professor Walsh to give his remarks.
Thank you very much. Good evening, esteemed guests, ladies and gentlemen. As you can see from the backdrop behind you, I'm speaking to you from Sydney, Australia. And so I want to pay my respects to the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, the traditional custodians of the land upon which I meet, and extend those respects to the other Indigenous owners of the lands upon which you might be meeting. So it's a great pleasure to speak to you today, and it's wonderful to hear of all the great initiatives going on in the UAE to support artificial intelligence. It is going to impact upon our lives in a magnificent way. Many estimates have been given of the economic value. It's going to add something like 15% to the world's GDP, some $15 trillion in the next 10 or 20 years. And if there's one thing that we do learn from history, which is that when we've had past economic shocks, like the global pandemic, that only hastens the adoption of the latest technologies, the latest automations. And so the predictions that we've seen in the past perhaps are going to underestimate the impact it's going to be. And as was described in those opening remarks, it's worth remarking that it's not just the economic value. There is, of course, immense economic value to be had, but it has great potential to improve our well-being all round, to improve our health, to improve the quality of our lives, to improve the sustainability, the way that we use the planet. So it has great potential to lift all of our lives. But that isn't without risks, that isn't without challenges. One of the things I want to talk about, actually I want to reserve my remarks really, is to talk about, well, how do you win the AI race? It's often described as an AI race. People talk about this being a race largely between the United States and China, and it's remarkable to see, for example, the advances that China has made in this field. They've really gone from being someone that you didn't notice at all to being a nation which by various measures now is leading the way, certainly in terms of number of scientific publications in artificial intelligence, in terms of number of patents, in terms of activity. That it's certainly impressive to see how they've gone from zero to being one of the leading nations. But you often hear it say, well, it's a race then just between the US and China. Europe isn't even in third place. So what can small nations like Australia or even smaller nations like the United Arab Emirates hope to do in a big race between gorillas like that? And I like to point out to people that it's perhaps misguided to think of it as a race. There is, of course, a scientific race. And like any scientific race, credit will be given to those who publish first and who get the patents. But a good way to understand this is to go back to a previous industrial revolution, the one that electricity gave us. AI is often compared to electricity. It's going to be a pervasive technology that powers our lives, that's in our offices, in our factories, in our homes. It's hard to imagine that we could live now without electricity. Not only does it literally power our lives, it also it provides all that data. It's the current upon which all that data travels. So it's an integral part of our lives. But to think back to the electricity race, and there was a race to understand and pioneer and deploy electricity. But that race wasn't won by Edison and Westinghouse and all the other, and Tesla and all the other pioneers that were around. Of course, they may have got the first patents, and there were some companies that did become quite wealthy to start with. But the whole world now has profited from the electricity race. All of us live in countries that are powered by electricity, and there are plentiful businesses around the world that use electricity. And the same is going to be true for artificial intelligence. It's going to be a race that all of us win. And so really the race here, the only race that we have is the race for your country, for your company, for your business to adopt AI quicker than your competitor does, so that you can start returning the benefits. So how can you win? How can a small nation like the UAE or Australia win its own personal AI race? And I think that requires some careful planning, and the technology is one that, I mean, the interesting thing about the AI science race is that most of it's open sourced. We publish openly in the scientific literature. It's technologies that you can pay for on the cloud quite cheaply. So what are the things that are going to hold you back? Well, there's three things that are going to hold you back. One is people. So it's wonderful to hear of all the initiatives in the UAE to educate people, because that is going to be one of the deciding factors, is if you have the skilled people who can use and pilot this technology. Two is data. Much of this is driven by technologies like machine learning, requires lots of data. And so it requires making that data available. And that's where, of course, government is one of the parts of the economy that has the most benefit from AI. It has some of the most data. It is a significant chunk of most economies, most developed countries. It's about 50% of your GDP is what your government is doing. Spending money, educating people, building roads, doing all the things the government does for us. That's a significant part of your economy. And so there's significant value and efficiencies that government can seek. It collects more data than almost any organization, is more trusted with that data than any organization. So it actually has potential if it can innovate. And that's one of the big challenges. Bureaucracies of government don't tend to be that innovative by their very nature. So you do have to think carefully and innovate in how you encourage government to do that. But one of the things the government can certainly do is to open up its data and allow the private sector to innovate with that. So there's really important conversations and things the government needs to do around data. And of course, regulating the use and misuse of data and ensuring the privacy is respected of citizens within the country as well. And then the third thing is regulation. We're discovering that these markets do need regulation. There are some big players out there who do need some guidelines under which to work. And we are seeing even small countries leading the way and actually innovating. I point to some examples in Australia. We, the second country in the world to have a Google tax to ensure that some return is given to the economy for some of the markets in which those big tech players are playing. And also some of the more corrosive uses and misuse of things like social media, those may require regulation. We're seeing plentiful debate about how we pay for news here in Australia, as an example. We saw a good example with the sad misfortune events that happened in Christchurch a little while back. Our government was very good and very quick at regulating there, that's saying that if harms are being posted, that those need to be taken down promptly. If not, we'll hold the people posting those things and putting those up even criminally liable. So there's plentiful things that we can do as small players to make sure that all of us profit from the AI race. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Toby. That was very insightful and very interesting questions as well to think about for later. Stephanie, on to you.
Yeah, so thank you. I am coming to you all from Australia as well, from the sunny Gold Coast. So I will also start with acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land, the Yungaba people, and pay respects to their elders past and present. So yeah, thank you, Professor Walsh. It was a really interesting introduction. I definitely obviously agree with a lot of what you said. I work largely, when I'm talking about AI, I'm working in healthcare. So I work for Datawi, and we build a precision medicine data platform. And, you know, I think that something that isn't often talked about when we talk about AI is that the basis of a lot of AI is data. And when we're talking about, you know, society and policy, you know, we really need to talk about data and data sharing, because on one hand, we want to have policies that allow us to share data with researchers nationally and internationally. to build these amazing tools that we can build. And that's one way that we can, I guess, if you want to talk about it as a race, is we can work together as countries to share data and create incredible, powerful diversity, you know, when we're using data from different nations in the sort of AI we're building in, especially when we talk about healthcare. So on one hand, you want to make sure that policy isn't blocking this sort of data sharing, but you also want to make sure that it's protecting the individual. And so I think that's something I have a lot of interest in, and it's an aspect of my work, you know, that I'm looking at within the healthcare system in Australia, is what policies do we have that don't work either side of that, and how can we adjust those so that we can rapidly advance data sharing for research and development in AI, but make it even more secure, so protect the individual even more. I think that's an aspect that's, yeah, it's often overlooked. But I think AI is incredible, and, you know, I do find that it's easier to talk about it in a specific application. And again, if we look at healthcare, you know, one of the greatest advantages that AI can give us in healthcare is prediction. So, you know, imagine, you know, being able to predict what your health is going to look like in the next 24 hours, especially if you're incredibly ill, you know, and doctors can treat you earlier. That's such a huge advancement. And if we can build in these kinds of tools into our healthcare system using AI, you know, we can create a healthier society. And obviously when you have a healthier society, you have a more productive society, which leads to, you know, enhancing the global economy, as always. So just linking in all of the themes there with that. But essentially, yeah, I think AI is an incredible tool. There's a really great quote from Stephen Hawking, which is, "The rise of powerful AI will be either the best or the worst thing ever to happen to humanity." And I think it's up to us to decide which way that goes. And again, that comes from powerful, positive collaborations across nations, so such as between Australia and the UAE. And also, again, strong policies that allow this advancement and are really protecting and safeguarding people, and essentially AI for good. That's what I really like to focus on. So yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you, Stephanie. We have a couple of questions, I think, about AI and health that we've already received. So we're going to discuss them in our conversation. And
Fantastic.
now on to you, Tim.
Sorry, rookie. Thank you very much. Really appreciate the invitation. I'm calling in from my office here in Canberra. And I too would like to pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging of the Ngunnawal people, which are the traditional custodians of the lands on which I'm calling from tonight. Thank you so much for the introduction and inviting me to speak on behalf of the Australian Government's Department of Industry, Science, Energy and Resources. This is the Australian Government Department which has responsibility for AI policy, which focuses on the technology's development as well as its use and application. I'll start by saying Australia recognises the promise of AI to change our lives for the better, from making our commutes easier, our banking more secure, and even our beaches safer. I'd love to point out that we have AI-equipped drones that patrol our shores, our coastlines, that look for sharks and alert swimmers to get out of the water. These technologies have proven themselves to be a vital part of our real-time response to national crises. Most recently, of course, we've seen AI technologies used to detect COVID-19 in lung scans and fast-track the development of potential vaccines. Were this forum held, I don't know, 6-7 months ago, I'd be talking about the role of AI in predicting and controlling Australia's devastating bushfires. I'll say perhaps the most important role for AI to play, the most important role for AI is the one that is yet to play, and that I think is in leading a technology-led economic recovery coming out of COVID. Throughout history, it's been the development and diffusion of new technologies that has been led to the greatest increase in income, wealth, and jobs. AI's ubiquity and speed, I think, puts it in a special class of technologies that promises to truly shift the dial when it comes to productivity growth. Australia's approach to AI has been to work closely with industry researchers, the global community, to ensure the development and use of AI is both done ethically and responsibly. This is of utmost importance for how the Australian government is thinking about AI policy now. Because without assurances that AI is being deployed with human-centric values in mind, that data has the appropriate protections and that technology is being deployed ethically, there will simply be no social license for governments and business to use AI. And realizing the benefits of this emerging technology will be like pushing water uphill. We're home to some world-leading AI researchers, including my co-panelist here, and some very smart industries. We boast global excellence at a number of our universities through Sydney, Adelaide, Queensland, here in Canberra, and of course Data 61, which is the data science arm of Australia's national science organisation, CSIRO. Data and AI technologies are contributing significantly to the competitiveness and productivity of Australia's mining, finance, space, manufacturing, logistics sectors. And a lot of that success has by no means been an accident. Over the past 10 years, the Australian Research Council has invested nearly $200 million into artificial intelligence and image processing research. We've invested in curriculum resources for schools, for AI in schools, and we've AI-focused PhD scholarships to support the next generation of AI experts. We've made significant investments in high-performance computing, digital infrastructure, open data initiatives, defence innovation, and STEM participation. And announced just in the budget, I think 2 weeks ago, we're supporting SMEs to develop tech-based solutions to support regulation and compliance. Realizing the enormous benefits of AI requires a purposeful effort to ensure the business environment is not just right for AI firms to emerge, but also that firms are able to adopt and deploy the technologies as well. And also that our workforce is capable of engaging with these technologies. As a small country, population of just 25 million, we have to be very considered about where we invest. At the end of 2019, we saw the release of Australia's AI technology roadmap. And the roadmap helped to identify 3 areas of strategic investment based on our existing strengths, opportunity to solve national problems, and the opportunity for export. Those areas were health, aged care and disability services, towns, cities and infrastructure, and natural resources and environmental management. Also key for a small nation like Australia is finding opportunities to work with our value partners globally. We've been active in this space in helping shape the AI landscape at fora such as the G20 and OECD. And earlier this year, Australia became a founding member of the Global Partnership on AI, which is the first multilateral fora specifically focused on artificial intelligence. I mentioned earlier that AI is both ubiquitous and fast. What I didn't mention, however, that the technology is also likely to be highly disruptive. In the long run, I'm confident that AI technologies will lead to an increase in our overall welfare. However, I think history has taught us that the intermediate short term is likely to be a period of transition. That said, and this is something that Professor Walsh kind of alluded to earlier as well, governments have today what no government has had ever before, and that's the benefit of history. We've seen how the economy has transitioned through the steam, electricity, and digital industrial revolutions, how that's impacted on our workforces, and how we've had to reform our regulatory, education, welfare, tax, trade systems. And all of those learnings I think will help us to help equip us to deal with the impacts of AI as well. That brings me back to the importance of ensuring AI is developed responsibly and ethically in a way that's human-centric and allows us to realize its full benefits. And to this end, we're ensuring that AI in Australia comes with the appropriate guide rails. We released Australia's AI ethics framework in November last year, and we've been piloting those principles closely with industry to help inform guidance materials. We've commissioned Standards Australia to develop an AI standards roadmap, and soon the Australian Human Rights Commission will release a report on human rights and technology coming early next year. I'll wrap up I'll just say, I think the biggest lesson we've had through all of our AI work is the importance of bringing everyone together. So government, industry, academia, the community sector. Amazing things happen when we have forums like this, and I want to say thank you truly for inviting me along. And I'm excited to see what's in store for the UAE in the year ahead. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Tim. So now we will move on to the question and answer section of our webinar for today. So for everyone watching, there's the Q&A right down there, and you can ask questions, and we will try our best to get to them, as we have also had questions submitted prior to the event. So we have a question regarding how can we ensure that sharing, data sharing will happen when it comes to commercial manufacturers who are reluctant to share with their competitors?
I can maybe speak a little bit to that one. I think we've lost Professor Walsh, so hopefully he comes back in. I think that, we often think about AI as the technology we're focusing on, but if you're talking about data sharing, there's also a lot of new technology and innovation that you can build in there in terms of privacy preserving and different kinds of R&D techniques that you can use, such as federated learning, where the data doesn't need to be directly given to someone, to an entity, in order for it to be used to build a model or for some, mining to be done on it. You can actually do that in more protected ways. I think obviously it's challenging to speak about these issues across all sectors. Again, my field of expertise is healthcare. And so, you're more looking at sharing data between healthcare facilities, which, they're not as protective of because it's not a commercial interest. It's definitely interesting when you start talking about, commercial interests and data sharing, because it sort of comes down to who owns the data. If it's data on individuals, who profits off of that. But, there's technology, again, to de-identify data. And the current policy in Australia is that if data is fully de-identified, it doesn't belong, it's not personal data anymore. So therefore, it's just an anonymous data point. And so in that instance, then, it can be leveraged for people to make a profit off if they've put work in to build a rich data set, added value to it. And it's private, it's anonymized, so the individual is protected. Then they might be wanting to share that data if they could ask for a payment for it. So I think if you're talking about ensuring that sharing will happen, you'd have to talk about that in the different sectors. I know that the number one thing, especially in healthcare, is privacy of the patient. So it's about implementing those advanced technologies to make sure that the patient's protected and the exposure of the individual and that data is minimized.
I don't have a great answer to that question, but I want to say that I absolutely love that question. I think that's a really, really, it's a very important question to ask. And often, or too much of the focus, I think, is often about public sector data and what data do governments have and how can we unlock that. And I think that's a fair question too, don't get me wrong. And there are initiatives, of course, underway to release more and more government data as is appropriate and share that with the community. But the private sector is responsible for collecting, has at its disposal an awful lot of information and data that would be useful for more purposes than what it's being used for. And I guess I've seen probably the sector I'll point to is the resources sector, mining, where so much information is collected in the exploratory phase, which unfortunately does kind of go to waste if the explorer moves on. There's not necessarily a commercial interest, but there's also not the mechanisms to pass that data along. So I don't have a sufficient answer to that question, but again, I just want to say how important it is to be thinking about private sector data and kind of what that will unlock when used in combination with public sector data and other information sources that are available.
Thank you for that, Tim. I think Professor Walsh is having maybe some connection issues. So we will move on to the second question. And I think, Stephanie, this is more directed towards you. So how to apply the use of AI in tracing COVID-19 cases?
That's an interesting question. Again, I'm not an expert on that specific application, but we did recently through the Queensland AI Hub run a datathon, and this was one of the problems that people were trying to solve. And they came up with some very interesting solutions. I mean, I'm not sure if everyone in the UAE who's watching is aware of the COVID app we have in Australia. I know other countries have similar apps. It's voluntary, so people can download it. And then what it does is it uses Bluetooth, and it doesn't track you personally, but it tracks the interaction of Bluetooth signals. So if someone who is flagged as being COVID positive, anyone whose Bluetooth signal had been close to their Bluetooth signal would be activated, and you know, they would be alerted that they need to be tested and be quarantined. Again, it's difficult because this was voluntary, so no one was forced to download it. Some people didn't trust it, they were unsure about it, so they didn't want to do it. I think for me, one of the biggest uses of AI is when you want to combine lots of different data sets to gain insights, which are very difficult for us to do at a simple level, and you need these complex neural networks to do that. So some of the solutions people were talking about were looking at public transport data, movement data, you know, from people phone pinging off towers. Again, all of this data would be anonymous. So it's not saying, you know, so-and-so first and last name was on this bus. It's more just the movement of people around an area, and then looking at the number of cases within that area. And then through that, and obviously through ways I can't explain because the AI would do it, you know, you can make inferences about where the highest rate of, you know, transmission is occurring. And I think that another interesting thing is, you know, looking at how can we most efficiently prevent, you know, community transmission of COVID. Maybe we're putting measures in place where they don't matter and not enough where they do. So is it mostly on trains that people catch it, you know, community transition, or is it at a grocery store, or, you know, using movement data and other sorts of data sets that you might not think of to do tracing. Those are just some of the ideas. You know, I don't have the solution, the perfect solution, but I think what it's really about is multiple data sets and some really advanced analytics looking at COVID cases. Yeah.
Wonderful.
The only thing I can't add too much to that. The only thing I'll try and do is just talk about. Stephanie mentioned the word trust, and I'll just say, from a policymaker's perspective, what a step change we've had here in Australia where it comes to trust in things digital, right? I guess I don't know if it's more exposure. I don't know if it is. Just the urgency of the situation, but I will say that there has been a step change in kind of the way people want to interact to the positive. People interact with data, people willingness to engage with government and data. Yes, there have been some trust issues, and not everyone has downloaded the app, the contact tracing app, but a lot of people did, and kind of I think it blew away a lot of expectations about how many people have been involved in this, and that's a really positive, outcome. And then the question for us is, well, how do we maintain that momentum? And again, it comes back to social license, and how do we kind of build on that trust to say, here are other things that we need to do, and that would benefit from greater use of data in these kind of intelligent systems.
Thank you. Professor Walsh, can you hear us?
Yes. Apologies, my computer crashed, and so I'm now on my mobile phone.
No, it's fine. Good to have you back. So we have also another question, and it's for all the panelists. What do you believe are the biggest risks and opportunities that are presented by AI?
I'd be happy to answer that question. I think it's a fantastically important question. I'm really glad it was asked. I think there are two or three really significant risks. The first is the increasing inequality that we've already seen, that perhaps has been driven by globalization, and that if we're not careful, technologies like AI will only further amplify and concentrate the wealth into the hands of the few. The second is the disruption it's having to the political discourse within our society. We're seeing some misuses of social media. Unfortunately, AI is behind some of the algorithms that are selecting our news feeds and promoting tweets and the like. And I think we have to be very careful about how our discourse is being fractured, and that's driving further apart our societies. So I think those are probably the greatest risks that we see, that these technologies may drive us apart as opposed to drive us together. But hopefully, as we've been facing this big international pandemic that has, I think, actually been showing that we're all one world together and we all face the same challenges, I'm hopeful that the same technologies will actually also help to drive us forwards and increase prosperity.
Yeah, awesome answer. I'd like to follow on with that and touch on something you mentioned about, driving people further apart and people who are already disadvantaged becoming more disadvantaged. And I think that something we haven't mentioned yet, but that is coming up to be a huge issue is bias and the dangers of the bias that exists in the data we have. Again, coming from a healthcare perspective, but this exists everywhere. Many groups left out of important research, and therefore the data isn't there. And so if you're feeding in, this kind of data which has inherent bias in it, you are even more greatly disadvantaging those people and those groups. And so I think that is why, you hear a lot of people harp on about diversity in building AI, but it is so important because we want the benefits that our AI can bring to us to reflect and benefit everyone in society, not just certain groups. And, these things, when they happen, are often not malicious, they're not intentional. And that's the scary thing, is we're not aware. It's just that these biases exist. And so we need to be aware of them. And the best way is to really have diversity. And I guess that's part of me being an ambassador for young women leaders in AI is women are just one group of many that need to be inclusive and encouraged to step up to be involved, because I think it can be quite intimidating, and people can feel like, I'm not a techie, I don't belong in that space. But I think it's part of that educating and removing the fear, the mystery around AI, and encouraging everyone to be involved in it who has an interest.
On the greatest risk side of things, I'm not quite sure how I want to answer that. Part of me wants to say, maybe the greatest risk we have is perhaps an over-reliance on the technology, right? And kind of AI is now making decisions about different, if it's from an administrative point of view, maybe it's border control or it's policing or it's who gets a home loan and so on, and kind of, it's replacing what used to be maybe judgment and some kind of human interaction that's kind of got experience and seasoned and so on, and there's an over-reliance on the technologies to kind of make those decisions for us. Maybe that's our greatest risk. Then part of me also wants to say that the greatest risk is also an under reliance on the technologies as well, and being too kind of trigger shy to bring them on board where they can make these wonderful decisions, and maybe they're going to make better choices than what that traditional approaches could do, and all that kind of the experience. Maybe that breeds bias, maybe that breeds bad decisions, and this is why we're looking at AI in the first place. So I think there's probably two sides of the coin there on greatest risks. On opportunities for AI, I guess I don't know. I just want to say I'm excited. I'm very optimistic about this. I'm an economist by trade, and you talk about technology like this, and it's all about productivity growth and contribution to well-being. And sure, I think that's very exciting. And yes, can move the needle, and kind of it's more posed to do that than some of the other technologies or other reform areas. That's not kind of why I'm getting excited about the promise of AI. It's all about the national challenges for me. The promise of AI to make some significant gains when it comes to health, the environment, safety, on those fronts, I think, which is truly kind of going to contribute to a better society or a better life in the years to come.
Can I mention one more risk? It's connected back to inequality, but I think it's really important that we talk about it, which is the impact it's going to have on people's employment. Not that AI is going to replace everyone's jobs, it's not going to do that, but there is going to be a big disruption. There are certain jobs that will disappear and certain new jobs that will be created. And I think the biggest risk is how we support people through that transition. How do we make sure that people get themselves re-skilled so that they can do the new jobs of the future? And maybe we will end up working a bit less. That's actually been the history of technological progress in the last 100 years. We do work less, most of us, than we used to. And that's something to be celebrated. But we do need to make sure that everyone is brought along and that people do get re-skilled so they have new jobs for the future.
Thank you all for your answers. So we'll have another question. How do you build foundational trust in AI? For example, people having enough confidence in the technology to fly aboard a pilotless commercial passenger aircraft?
That is a fantastic question, and I love the analogy because I think it's a really good analogy. The fact that flying is now the safest form of transport by many metrics, by passenger kilometers, it's by far the safest form of transport. But 100 years ago, when we started flying, it wasn't. It was the most dangerous thing you could do. Many people got killed in the early pioneering days. Planes used to fall out of the sky all the time. So how did we go from that to what it is today, where it's now, you're actually more likely to die driving to the airport than you are flying in the plane, wherever it happens to be going. We did that by setting in place appropriate institutions and frameworks so that we can put our lives in the hands of the capable pilot. And actually, it's not really the hands of the capable pilot. It's mostly machines. It's mostly 95% of the time, it's actually a computer that's flying you. If it's a bumpy landing, you know it was the pilot took control again and wanted to keep his or her practice up. But the smoother the landing, the more likely it was automated. And so we need to make sure that where we are putting people's lives in the hands of machines, that we have similar safeguards and institutions in place so that, that we can put, without having to know the mechanics of what's going on, we can put our lives in their hands. It's the same as when you go to the doctor. You trust your doctor with your life. You know that there are institutions in place that certify doctors, that train doctors, that make sure that the drugs that doctors prescribe you are safe and don't kill their patients. And we need to have those many layers, many structures in place. It's not just regulation, it's also about institutions and norms so that we can. And we don't want to end up in a world where everyone has to understand what AI is, whether they can trust it. Just like when you go and buy a washing machine, you don't have to know anything about water conservation. You just have to say, does it have 5 stars? I'll have the 5-star machine, please. The same is what we want to end up with artificial intelligence. You want to say, does it have 5 stars? Is it certified by the government? Then I can trust it. Then I can go and buy this smart speaker and know that it's going to treat my privacy with respect and has all the appropriate safeguards put in place. When I go and buy this diagnostic system for my hospital, I know that I can put my patients' lives in the hands of the system because it is appropriately controlled and regulated. So we need to develop those institutions. We need to develop those norms. We need to develop those rules. So it's an interesting journey that we need to go on so that we can end up like it is with an aeroplane, sitting back, sipping our gin and tonic again.
Yeah, I'm not sure if I have any good answer to that. You know, it is interesting. I don't know even how I would feel knowing consciously that there is no human pilot in a plane. And I do wonder if it would just be quite a long transition period of still having someone there while having an automated flight system. So I don't have an answer. I guess it probably will just be time and you know, when people see these things, you know, occurring on a daily basis and safely, then you build more trust in it. But you know, I think a lot of us are on board of still feeling apprehensive of something that we're not so familiar with, even if we are in the field?
Yeah, it's a very interesting question, especially for government. Toby, I don't know if you want me certifying algorithms or not, but I think certainly I think having the institutions there, the market mechanisms in place to kind of help with that, I think changes those norms that we've been talking about, and that's I guess in the long run how we'll get there. My answer to this question, how do you build foundational trust? I'd probably want to tackle that more from a literacy and exposure perspective. For many, AI is a black box. Can I trust it? I don't know what data is going in. Is it private data? Is it my data? Who knows what's happening with it? I don't understand it. Because I don't understand it, I'm scared of it. There are, the more familiar, the more exposure that society has with those systems, I think it's going to be baby steps along the way, but you realize you've got AI in your phone, you've got AI kind of doing your banking, you've got AI controlling the traffic lights and so on. Kind of the more of a spotlight that's happening, the more of a norm that becomes. The less of a step I think it is to jumping on a plane with no pilot. There are reasons why I wouldn't jump on a plane right now anyway. It's hard to do with AI or having a pilot there or not, but it's that's the kind of the things. That literacy question is kind of how I think I would get us there.
Tim, I can answer your question. I think there are plentiful low-stake decisions where I wouldn't want government to be getting in the way by certifying algorithms that would just be a tax on our lives. But there are lots of high-stake decisions, whether that be autonomous cars or autonomous planes, where I definitely would. You can't put anything in a plane that's not certified by the appropriate civil aviation authority with good reason. And that's how aviation's got to be so safe, because the only things you're allowed to put in a plane are those that have met the appropriate standards. And I would hope the same would be applied to autonomous cars, autonomous planes and the like. And actually, I do have a prediction in my book how we'll end up with autonomous planes. It will start with autonomous cargo planes, where no one's life is at stake, and so everyone will be happy to see the efficiencies and the cheapness that brings. And then after a decade or so, people will look around and notice that the cargo planes no longer crash. It's only the planes full of people that crash. And people will wonder why that is, and then realize that actually it would be far safer to remove the pilots, because actually most aircraft accidents are caused by pilot error these days. It's very rarely by systems. There are a few systems like 737 MAX where it is the system, but it was the interaction between the pilot and the system there that went wrong. So we'll end up in a system where cargo planes stop crashing because they're autonomous, and passengers realize that their lives might be safer if they actually removed the human element who's making many of the mistakes.
Yeah, the economist in me is kicking in now, and I want to say it's also, I think those cargo planes will probably start offering some cheap seats, and you'll get people kind of coming on board, just be attracted to the price as well. But yeah, absolutely agree. You don't want me making those kind of you probably do want me there for those high stake decisions. You don't want me there for the low stakes decisions. Kind of signing off on these, and I think it would be highly inefficient. There's a risk profile, there's a risk assessment that needs to be done. There's triaging about kind of where do you need certification or not. Health is another kind of great example of where the stakes are much higher and the institutions need to be stronger.
And there are intermediate levels. I mean, so we have this with washing machines, right? So you have a 5-star washing machine. No one's life is at stake whether you buy a 5-star or 1-star washing machine, but there's an industry standard that you can sign up for, and if you meet the standard, you can perhaps sell a few more washing machines. And so we'll have those sorts of standards emerging in AI products, so that people can actually just look at whether it has the right number of stars or not.
Yeah, and again, with healthcare, a lot of people will be familiar with the FDA in the US, in Australia, it's the TGA, and we already have those regulatory bodies, and now we just need to apply those safeguards for human health with AI. There's just a certain measures they need to meet, and they still need to be run through, I suppose, clinical trials and So those regulatory bodies and things already exist. And then, we talk about sort of software or AI as a medical device if you're using a specific application of it. So, there's already a lot in place to protect us in certain applications, not from everything, but we're not only at the very, very beginning with everything.
Wonderful. So we move on to another question. How do you think how can governments cooperate internationally, to help, further enhance AI and regulate AI?
I'm going to say something rather controversial here, which is I think that there's not actually much opportunity for transnational regulation of AI. And I go back again to my analogy with electricity, which is that we didn't, electricity, you point out, is a much simpler thing than AI, right? So if you ask me, my first degree is in physics, you ask me to regulate electricity, I'd say, well, we're going to agree on the number of volts, we're going to agree on the frequency, and we're going to agree on the shape of the plugs. Well, we never managed to do that with electricity. We all have a different number of pins in our plugs. Countries work on many different voltages and frequencies. And that would have been simple to agree to. And so the agreements that we're going to get internationally about AI, I think, are going to be rather modest. And actually, the appropriate level to regulate AI is actually going to be much more at the national level. Because there's lots of trade-offs in place here. In China, there may be certain respects given for the community over the individual that you wouldn't perhaps find in the United States. There's a trade-off there between individual rights and collective welfare that's being made. And equally, there'll be different value judgments made in the United Arab Emirates and different value judgments made perhaps in Australia. And different things will be important, different freedoms will be put above others. Human rights is about often trading off these different values. There isn't an absolute scale to be put on here. And so those are ones where I think actually it's most appropriate to regulate at the national level. And the sorts of consensus, unfortunately, that we're going to be able to achieve at the international level are going to be rather modest. They're going to be the sorts of things that we've achieved with human rights. They're all very important rights and very important things that I'm very pleased the international community, diplomats, have been able to achieve. But they certainly are just a floor on what we need to achieve. And there are higher standards that I would hope we would actually aim for. And so actually, I think the most appropriate level to see much of the regulation is going to be at the national level. And we are starting to see that. We are starting to see that national governments are waking up to the idea that they can regulate. And it is an appropriate level. And the tech companies, even the biggest tech companies, will listen to that regulation. There was a time, I think, where it was thought that you couldn't and you shouldn't regulate the tech space. You couldn't, because somehow it was different. It wasn't physical, it was digital bits. They didn't have physical existence. Well, we're discovering that it's perfectly possible to write regulation that applies to the digital space. We have some wonderful examples like the GDPR in Europe, which show you can actually increase people's privacy and actually do this in a positive way that will actually not stifle innovation, but actually help innovation to happen. I think that was the other fear that people had, politicians had, was that you shouldn't regulate because that would stifle innovation. I think quite the opposite. If we don't regulate some of these spaces, we're going to discover that there's going to be a big techlash, and the innovations that we do want to achieve, we won't have lost the public's trust. So it's going to be really important that we do find appropriate places. And I certainly know a lot of my friends in the tech companies, and in private, many of them will welcome some greater regulation. They say at the moment, in many settings, it's a race to the bottom, and they would welcome some flaws being put in the behaviors of some of their competitors. Now, they said, we prefer not to do this, but our competitors will do this. And so some national regulation will stop some of those bad races happening.
Yeah, I guess my reaction to that, Toby, I don't think that's necessarily as controversial as you might think. Yeah, I think there's probably a recognition of that as well. Where I see the main benefit of the multilateral forums, G20, OECD, kind of partnerships and so on, is really kind of highlighting best practice. And the problems that we've got are difficult, they're complex, and they're new and they're novel. And from a blank sheet of paper, we might not necessarily understand might not necessarily know the best way to approach those problems straight off the bat. But through those forums and through our partners, other countries have experience about how they've handled it, for better or for worse. And you can get an awful lot of learning about, well, country X has done this, has had a positive experience with regulating in this way. Country Y went in a different approach and had some negative fallout and kind of probably should avoid that approach. So getting together and having those experiences and those learnings and that channeling of information in that sense, I think is really beneficial.
I'm going to agree with you, Tim. I think we're on the same page, actually. I think it's wonderful to see that the experiences that you have in one country actually are useful lessons that the rest of the world can share.
Thank you for your answers. So we have another interesting question. So to which extent can AI technologies help economic development and achieving the sustainable development goals?
I'll have a crack at that. That's another fantastic question. If you go through the 17 SDGs, almost every one of them, there are very positive things that AI can already do, and undoubtedly even more that AI will be able to do in the future. So I think it is one of these technologies that will help us use the planet in a more sustainable way, to use less carbon. As an example, I take from my own work, I've been working with a very large multinational company in Australia who spend a couple of $100 million each year on fuel. They have a very large delivery fleet, 800 trucks. And of course, Australia is a big place. We do a lot of driving to get to all of our cities. And we were able to cut their fuel bill by 10 to 15%. And that was $20 or $30 million of savings they made every year. It's a recurrent saving. There's a very competitive business they were in. Their profits that last year were $40 million. So that was a big increase in their profits that year. And these were recurrent savings, and they weren't just increasing their profits and reducing their fuel bill. They were reducing the carbon dioxide footprint of their business by thousands of tons of CO2. It was a huge, great decrease in their carbon footprint. And those are examples of the sorts of things that we can easily do. We can do less with more by getting computers to make better decisions. And humans couldn't optimize 800 trucks. There's no way that one human could do that. And just be able to save 10 to 15% of their fuel bill every year is an amazing saving, an example of the sorts of things that AI can help us to try and deal with. Undoubtedly, the wickedest problem still facing us once we get out of this pandemic, which is the climate emergency.
Yeah, and following on from that, again, back to healthcare, I know one of the goals is around healthcare and healthcare, equal access to healthcare. And, a big barrier to healthcare for some is the cost. And, AI can make healthcare a lot more efficient and potentially more affordable and also more accessible. I know that I've been fortunate enough to be working with some people from Google Cloud, and they have some brand new technology which can allow AI and machine learning tools to be done remotely. So you don't need to be able to access a cloud server, which a lot of deep analytics for medicine do require. So you can be in a remote community and doing really advanced, diagnoses and treatment analytics, without needing that connection and that infrastructure. So it definitely can, radicalize the accessibility of healthcare and high-level healthcare, especially for remote communities and disadvantaged groups, which I think is really exciting.
I don't have too much to add to that, except, I go back to my early comments around the opportunities for AI. Yes, there's opportunities to increase well-being, but those wicked problems that the SDG kind of are defined around that, is one of wonderful frameworks for really kind of thinking about how do you apply these technologies to better the world.
It's wonderful to see that there's a very burgeoning area of AI called AI for good or AI for social good that many of my colleagues AI is a technology that can be used for many different purposes, but many of my colleagues are choosing to apply AI to these sorts of problems that have great social benefit.
Wonderful. That's so we will move on now to our last question before we end our webinar. So to what degree are universities and traditional higher education currently suited to preparing the next generations of AI experts?
I'll have a stab at that. I think everyone needs to understand AI. It's not just people who are going to be deploying the technology. I think it's going to be, we live digital lives now, and increasingly these are technologies that are going to touch our lives. And everyone needs to understand how these technologies work and what in particular are their limitations. I think if not, if these are just magic, then we will end up being taken advantage of, and we won't be people who are riding the wave and profiting from these technologies. So I think we should be teaching everyone, not just at university, but at high school even, and even perhaps younger than that, digital skills, computational skills, and ultimately the sorts of things that end up in artificial intelligence, because these are the technologies of the 21st century. We need to be, all of us need to be digital natives. And the irony is, of course, that the dirty secret is that computers are increasingly programming themselves. That's what machine learning is. It's computers programming themselves. It's not that we're going to need more and more people to program the computers. We're going to need more and more people to interface with the computers and to understand how these technologies work and where to question their answers and so on. So I think all of us need to be AI literate. But of course, if you want to be someone who's pushing forwards the frontiers of AI, there are plentiful good places, universities in Australia and UAE, to go and study that. There are plentiful opportunities to have jobs. It's rather distressing to see how well paid my students are when they leave our teaching. They all end up with six-figure salaries, multiple offers from many different companies. So it's a very worthwhile profession to move into.
Yeah, and I absolutely agree with that. And also definitely, I can't comment on how well equipped universities are. I don't have sort of the stats on what courses are available, but I do know, having graduated not too long ago, that, AI was not mentioned in non-ICT courses. So of course it's in the IT field, but I think what we do need to see an expansion of is when we talk about the application of it. And, at the AI Hub, we're talking now about how can we support higher education to deliver, courses on AI in specific sectors. So, especially in medicine, again, I was going to go back to medicine, but, teaching our doctors, first of all, it's not going to take their jobs. We're going to need them to understand it, to interact with it, to make it better. And so those are the sorts of things, they don't need to know how to build AI, but I think that, they need to understand the application and important aspects that they will need to interact with, and also understand how important they are and their expertise in their field is into helping AI grow and become something good and beneficial for society. So, I think there's room to grow in terms of universities, but I do think that, that's people are on board with that, and hopefully that will expand in the coming years.
We recently did an exercise. We went through, Australia's got around about 40 universities, and we did an exercise just to try and find out where the different centres of excellence were in University of Sydney, University of Melbourne, Queensland, and so on. And I think I actually struggled in the end to find a university in Australia that didn't have a kind of Australian Institute for Machine Learning, Australian Institute for AI, whatever it was. Everyone's computing science and engineering schools and faculties that'd be more or less rebadged to be around that kind of AI, machine learning technologies space. So I think universities have certainly been responsive and certainly getting the message, and I think that's, they've been very, very adaptive. I think that's fantastic. But Stephanie, you stole my point. What I wanted to say was, it's those that are kind of interacting with the technology that I think is next, maybe, or kind of a little bit underserved. So I'll give an example from the legal profession. yes, you can think about AI being used, to replace paralegals and kind of do that paralegal work and things, but it's actually the lawyers who are assessing about what you can and can't do with data, or you can and can't do when it comes to AI and regulations, and kind of giving a green light or red light around that. And if they don't have a mature understanding of where the technologies are at, if they don't have a mature understanding of what the regulations and the law actually says or is intending to do, then I tend to find that they're very risk averse. And then you get the red lights much more often. And then that's an education piece that I think is next to have, and kind of it's a maturity question.
Well, I'll also just take a small answer for that question. As I mentioned in my opening statement, the UAE is now home to the Mohammed bin Zayed University for AI, which is a graduate level university, that focuses on artificial intelligence exclusively. Things like machine learning and all of that. So that is something in the UAE that we are, quite proud of, to have a university at that level that has just started, in their first semester. So it's, we hope that, the research that comes out of that university as well will not only just benefit, the UAE, but also will lead to greater advances in AI, globally in the future. And hopefully will also lead to, benefits for all of us, for all of humanity. And that's the benefit of research. Once you share the information with your partners and and other countries and other institutes, that's when, the people get the benefit. That's when they reap the fruits. So with that, I think we have reached the time to end our webinar. Unfortunately, it's been a great discussion. I didn't even feel the time fly by. So thank you all for making the time with us today. Toby, Stephanie, Tim, you've all been great and very insightful. And I'm sure our audience have been, they've listened to you and they've heard all your opinions and thoughts on a wide range of questions about AI. And I think it left them with a lot to think. And thank you again for joining us in today's webinar. And hopefully we'll all meet each other in person soon after COVID is over.
Sounds good. Thank you very much for having me.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Night.